Thank you so much, Jack, for taking the time to be with me on the podcast today. I appreciate you coming on the show. First discovered you from, you wrote a piece called Anti-Aging State of the Art on lesswrong.com, popular website for people interested in like being rational, and tends to be kind of an optimistic, technology leaning, effective altruism type of readership. Would love to start, obviously I want to dig into aging itself and, maybe cover some of your background and how you got into it as well, but would love to start by just getting kind of an overview, kind of a la your article on your thoughts on aging, which a lot of people, um, maybe are not paying attention to or just haven't really had the appropriate hook to get them intrigued about, and would love to, your article is super interesting and I would point people there certainly after the episode, but a voiceover I think could be super helpful as well. So would love to kind of start there.
Great. Well, thanks for having me, Jake. So I'll just summarize what I talked about in this article, which, as you said, is anti-aging state of the art. You can look it up. So basically, aging is one of the biggest problems on Earth in the sense that 9 out of 10 people in developed countries, 7 out of 10 people in the world die of aging. So it's the elephant in the room. It's been described by some geroscientists who are aging researchers as the climate change of healthcare. It's this enormous problem that unfortunately hasn't quite yet captured the public's imagination. And as a result, if you ask people on the street, should we cure aging? Can we cure aging? Most people will first of all, they'll reject the scientific feasibility of being able to cure aging and think that that's science fiction. But many people also don't even think we should cure aging. They say that, it'll lead to overpopulation, it'll lead to immortal dictators, it'll lead to distributional justice issues. And so there are all these kind of responses that we have and these fears we have about actually slowing down or even completely eradicating the aging process. So with that in mind, I'll just talk a bit about, okay, what is aging? How can we solve it? Is anti-aging a real scientific field? So aging kills 100,000 people per day, and the way they die can vary. Some of them will die of cancer. Some of them will die of heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's disease. But all of these diseases of aging, which are responsible for these age-related deaths, are all driven by the same underlying biological processes, which we call the hallmarks of aging. So these are basically, you can think of them as forms of damage. A good analogy that Aubrey de Grey, who I know you previously had on the podcast, gave for this idea of damage accumulation is that of a car. If you don't service a car, it accumulates damage over time. And eventually that damage becomes so pervasive that the car will break down. Well, the human body, although it's many orders of magnitude more complicated, is analogous to a car in many respects, in the sense that we're made up of trillions of cells, and just by virtue of being alive, in the normal wear and tear of normal life, we accumulate damage, and that damage ultimately does kill us. This process is the process we call aging. Now, many people don't think of aging in those kind of hardcore biological terms, but if we're thinking about biological aging, which is distinct from chronological aging, that's essentially what we're talking about. We're talking about this process by which you take a healthy 20-year-old and you just let them live for 60 years and they become an 80-year-old who typically has multiple comorbidities, which means they have multiple age-related forms of decline. So that decline doesn't happen for no reason. It happens due to these forms of damage. So if someone has wrinkles or gray hair, or they have diabetes as a result of their aging, most of these age-related phenotypic, or in other words, changes, like bodily physiological changes, are the byproduct of cellular forms of damage that accumulate. And without getting too much into the weeds, these include things like changes to your metabolism. So in particular, deregulated nutrient sensing, telomere attrition. So most of the listeners may be aware that your telomeres contract, or the telomeres, the telomeres, which are the caps of the chromosomes, they contract with age, which is telomere attrition. But also you have things like mitochondrial dysfunction. So the powerhouses of the cell, they decline. you have more zombie cells in your body. This is cellular senescence, which we'll talk a bit about later. So essentially, these forms of damage drive the diseases of aging. So in my neuroscience background, we looked at diseases such as Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and a key factor in these diseases are the hallmarks of aging. Things like cellular senescence, this accumulation of zombie cells that occurs just by being alive. It results in inflammation that harms the nervous system, to put it simply. And this results in the kind of neurodegeneration associated with aging, with normal aging. Now, all of this, what I'm describing, which we call biological aging, is distinct from chronological aging, which is the process of simply being alive. And I think in people's minds, a lot of people, they think that chronological aging and biological aging are the same thing, but actually they're distinct, they're independent. And one way of thinking about this is two people who are chronologically 50 years old could have different biological ages. Someone who exercises, eats well, sleeps well, etc., even if they're chronologically 50 years old, may have a biological age of 40 years old because they're young for their age, and they might even look young for their age. Another person who maybe smokes, eats a lot of fast food, doesn't exercise, doesn't sleep very well, may have a biological age of, say, 60 years, which means their aging is accelerated. So chronological aging and biological aging are not the same thing. And what we're ultimately trying to do with anti-aging is not stop people from existing chronologically, but stop them from accumulating biological damage. In other words, to retard the the biological aging process. Now, to give you the white mirror perspective of what this looks like, it means that with anti-aging technologies in the future, we want to have a world in which every single human being on Earth, they develop until the age of, say, 20 or 30 years old, and then they stop aging. Another way to phrase that is they don't accumulate damage over time. So even if they're chronologically 80 years old, they would still look like a 20-year-old. And that may seem very science fiction, but actually we've already shown in mouse models that we can do this to a small extent. We can take a mouse that is equivalent in human years of, say, 70 years old, and if we give them drugs to kill their senescent cells, which are called senolytic drugs, we can make those mice look like and act like and perform physically as though they're a, say, 40-year-old or 50-year-old in human terms. So we know that this process of aging is malleable. In other words, the damage that accumulates over time, it can be modified. And so really, the goal of anti-aging is to find therapies that can keep us young, keep us youthful, and keep us healthy. I think a lot of us, when we think about health, we neglect the fact that aging is such a crucial part of health. If you're a quote unquote, healthy 80-year-old, you're never going to be as healthy as a healthy 20-year-old. Why is this? It's because your body has accumulated damage over time. And so even if you're in the top 99th percentile for an 80-year-old in terms of your health, you're still much less healthy than the 50th percentile 20-year-old. And that's because you've accumulated a lot of damage. And unless we use anti-aging therapies to repair that damage, then even though you're healthy for your age group, you're not as healthy objectively. Unless we repair that, you're not going to achieve your maximum state of physical health and fitness. So just to touch on one other point, I think a lot of people think that the fact that we're trying to cure cancer and that we're trying to cure Alzheimer's and so on means that eventually aging will just solve itself. But that's not quite true, because trying to cure cancer is like to use the car analogy, is like waiting until a car completely breaks down. You never maintain the car. You just wait till it completely breaks down, and then you try and repair the car. Versus anti-aging, which is basically maintaining the car systematically, every few months, so that the car is always or always in near perfect condition and is always functioning effectively. With the human body, we are an unlucky species as Homo sapiens in that we don't exhibit negligible senescence. Negligible senescence is a phenomena that some species, such as tortoises, hydras, and these, some species exhibit, and the naked mole rat, which is a mammal like us, whereby they don't age, which means their biological risk of disease does not change over time. As humans, we have an exponentially increasing mortality curve. This is called Gompertz's law. You can look this up on Wikipedia. And basically it means that after the age of about 30, every 8 years, your chance of dying doubles. Why does it double? It doubles because the damage that you're accumulating associated with aging predisposes you to the diseases of aging. Now, if you're 90 years old, you're probably going to die pretty soon. You may die of diabetes, you may die of heart disease, you may die of cancer, but the lowest common denominator is that you have aged, which means you've accumulated senescent cells. Your telomeres are short. All these underlying biological hallmarks have predisposed you to die. Now, what actually is the straw that broke the camel's back and that ends up killing you? That can change. And that's why if you look at statistical data, you may get the wrong idea. You may think, oh, cancer kills this many people. But you may not see that even if, and this is a really crucial point that I want your listeners, Jake, to understand, is that even if we cured every single form of cancer on Earth with a click tomorrow, that would only extend healthy human lifespan by 2 years on average. And that's because cancer is an age-related disease such that if you don't die of cancer, you'll die of another age-related disease. So the people who would have died of cancer due to their aging predominantly will now die of something else, such as heart disease, such as diabetes, and so on. So really, the purpose of anti-aging is to solve the root cause of all of these diseases. Not only is this a more feasible strategy for radical life extension to live past 100, 150, 200 years old, but it's also probably one of the best strategies we have for preventing cancer, for preventing all these age-related diseases. Because the truth is, if you look at the data, the rate of cancer and Alzheimer's and diabetes and heart disease is very low up until the age of about 40. And then after 40, it just starts to ramp up, such that the rate at 80 years old for these age-related diseases, I'll use diabetes as an example, is 1,000 times higher at 85 years old compared to 35 years. It goes up 1,000-fold. And that's not a coincidence. It's because the body has accumulated this damage, which is the hallmarks of aging, those 9 forms of cellular rust, if to take the car analogy, that ultimately predispose us to these conditions. So really with anti-aging, we're keeping the car functioning, we're keeping it well maintained so that we don't get cancer, so that we don't get heart disease, or at least we get these diseases with the same frequency as we would someone who's 20 years old. Think about the last time you heard of a 20-year-old who had Alzheimer's disease. Extremely rare. In fact, there are, I don't even know if I've heard of a case such as that. And that's because it takes time for the damage to accumulate. For the neurological damage associated with Alzheimer's to accumulate, it takes time, and it takes these, this inflammation, all of these hallmarks for that damage really to progress to such a level that you start seeing symptoms. Now, the other thing I'll note is that, all of these are long-term processes. You may think someone just gets cancer and, it's a tragedy. It is a tragedy, but it's not an immediate phenomenon. It's the product of a long time period of accumulating this damage. And there's some great papers published in the world's leading scientific journal, which is called Nature, where they explain the changes associated with these hallmarks of aging that I've been referring to, that show how the microenvironment within the body, changes such that it's favorable for tumorigenesis, which is the formation of a cancerous tumor. So we can see, if we look at neurodegeneration, if we look at cancer, if we look at any of these individual diseases, we can see that there is a very clear link between these underlying biological phenomena, which we call the hallmarks of aging. And that's also a really great scientific paper. That's the most highly cited scientific paper in the aging field. I think it has 7,000 or more citations. You can Google it, the hallmarks of aging. There's a clear link between these hallmarks and all of the diseases of aging, which are the things that kill most people on Earth today. So that's the basic kind of premise. The premise of anti-aging is that we accumulate this damage in our body, And we're using an engineering approach to kind of repair that damage. And the way that this differs from current medicine is current medicine actually allows all that damage to accumulate to such a degree that people start having severe symptoms, whether they have clinical symptoms of Alzheimer's or they have cancer or so on. And then we try and intervene. That's called geriatric medicine, or, we're trying to treat the diseases of aging. But that's pretty obviously not the best approach if we think about things from the car analogy. And if we just think about that old adage, which is, nip it in the bud, or prevention is better than a cure. We should try and target things at the root cause. The root cause of cancer and neurodegeneration and heart disease is basically aging. Now, there are other factors that can play a role. For example, if you have a lot of head trauma. So for me, I'm very interested in mixed martial arts. Probably not the best if I were to, take it to a higher level and compete. Probably not the best thing for Alzheimer's disease, because if you take a lot of blows to the head, if you do boxing or other combat sports or other contact sports, you're accumulating damage at a faster rate. That's another way of saying you're aging faster. And in fact, many behaviors that we undertake, such as smoking or eating a poor diet and so on, one way to formulate those in your mind and understand those is that you're accelerating the aging process. You're increasing the rate at which damage is accumulating in your body. And therefore, smokers have higher rates of cancer, etc. But the point is that actually young smokers don't have a particularly high rate of cancer. So the rate of non-smokers in their 80s is like hundreds of times higher than the rate of cancer in smokers who are in their 20s. And again, this is because it takes time for all that damage to accumulate to such a level whereby people start getting cancers and these diseases of aging. So really, aging is really the root cause of so many of the public health challenges we have today. It's not only responsible for the most deaths worldwide, but it's also responsible for immense suffering. If you think about the fact that most people alive today, and definitely in the Western world, but even in places like Africa, where the two leading causes of death are stroke and I believe cardiovascular disease, both of which are age-related diseases, most people are dying of old age, which involves 10 to 15 years typically of this slow, painful decline. If you die of, say, a natural disaster or something, it's a tragedy, but it's quick. But with aging, it's a slow, painful death. And yet that's the default. That's 70% of deaths worldwide, is this slow, painful decline. You lose your faculties, you lose your ability to be pain-free, you're in pain and so on. And this is just the default. And so anti-aging, even if you don't think that we should solve death, I think it's pretty easy to make a case that solving aging is good just from a suffering and kind of like a hedonic utilitarian perspective, given how much suffering worldwide. In fact, it's actually 30% of all disability adjusted life years lost, if we want to quantify it, which is the single largest source of DALYs worldwide is attributable to aging. So then the next question is, well, what evidence do we have that this damage repair approach is actually feasible? If someone had have told me like 10 years ago that we're trying to solve aging, most people and even scientists in the field would probably have laughed at them. And, I probably would have not taken them seriously either. But the good news is that in the last 5 or 10 years, a lot of compelling evidence has come out that indeed aging is malleable. In other words, it's plastic, it's flexible, it's modifiable. And this old kind of dogma that I think many people hold in their hearts, that aging is just this inevitable process, this fatalistic view that we have, which we can touch on later, which is the pro-aging trance. It's not true, and that we can do things to modify aging. On a simple level, we can exercise and eat well and sleep well. But on a more advanced level, we can actually start making use of therapies, senolytics, mTOR inhibitors. In the future, parabiosis or blood plasma transfer, or basically filtering certain factors in our blood that are associated with accelerated aging. And also things like cellular reprogramming, which is what David Sinclair, the Harvard scientist who wrote a great book, which is called Lifespan, Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to, in 2019. What he talks about is this idea of reprogramming your epigenome, reprogramming cells by using these Yamanaka factors to basically turn back the clock, excuse me, to turn back the clock and to revert cells to a more youthful state where they can differentiate into tissues in a younger form and basically regenerate your organs. So there's a lot to look forward to in the anti-aging space. I think the key things for listeners and for anyone who's interested in aging and anti-aging to understand is, number one, aging is potentially one of the biggest problems in the world. I mean, tell me something else that's killing 70% of people worldwide that's a solvable problem. Number two, we have a decent enough understanding of aging where therapies and therapeutic approaches are beginning to work. And we're seeing that in many mice models. We can extend, I think Laura Deming, who I know you're familiar with, Jake, has a page on her website actually where she's compiled all of the scientific literature regarding different methods of extending mice lifespan. And there's well over, I believe, 150 or so. So we know that there's many different ways to extend lifespan in model organisms, but we also have data in humans now, as of, say, 2019, whereby we can actually reverse the epigenetic age of individuals using different therapies. For example, using an injection into the thymus and what's called thymic rejuvenation, where you provide growth hormone and metformin and DHEA, this kind of cocktail of drugs to rejuvenate the thymus. And in this paper by Greg Fay, they actually reversed epigenetic age by 2.5 years after 1 year of treatment. So although, epigenetic age is just one biomarker of aging and it doesn't tell the full story, that's a very promising sign that as a proof of principle that aging in humans, not just in mice models, but also in humans, is malleable. And although we may not be able to extend the lifespan in humans by 1000%, as we can do with the worm C. elegans by modifying a few genes, it's promising that between all the new approaches that are emerging, as I mentioned, cellular reprogramming, parabiosis, senolytics, mTOR inhibition, and many other approaches, thymic rejuvenation, it's very feasible that within the lifetimes of most people alive today, we will definitely start seeing the beginnings of the longevity revolution and the emergence of the anti-aging industry, not the anti-aging industry that exists today, which is this basically a sham industry, $60 billion industry based on cosmetic products that don't actually modify the underlying hallmarks of aging, but a true anti-aging industry with therapies that can be taken to kind of supplement the diet and supplement the existing strategies that people are undertaking, such as exercise and sleeping well and so on, to extend lifespan beyond the limits set by nature. If we really think about it, who wants to die of aging? Aging sucks. We don't want to die of aging. But unfortunately, without anti-aging technology, we don't have a choice. And we certainly don't have a choice to remain youthful and physically capable of running, marathons into our hundreds, right? Like that's not possible unless we have technologies that can keep us youthful and keep us young. So as a high-level overview, that is essentially the problem and just a brief introduction to anti-aging.
Thank you, Jack. That's a excellent intro and an overview, and I appreciate you you starting us off there. And now we can hopefully dig into some questions on some of these concepts that you've introduced, and maybe some that you haven't yet kind of addressed as well. One thing that I think may be an interesting place to start is I had Balaji Srinivasan on the podcast previously, and he raised this concept that a lot of his listeners were interested in, which was that it's actually originally a Larry Page concept, which is that 10x can sometimes be preferable to 10% and actually easier than 10%. And I think the strategy and engineering approach of attacking aging directly and the damage that accumulates over a person's lifetime versus the kind of existing approaches of gerontology and geriatrics is kind of representative of that. Let's go for 10x versus 10%. You mentioned how if we were to solve cancer, for example, we might save 2 years on global average lifespan. We might increase global average life expectancy by just a couple of years because they would die of heart disease or Alzheimer's or another aging related disease. Whereas if we can, even just by 10% figure out a way to slow aging, that might be 8 years. And if we can do it by 20%, maybe that's 16 years. And this is rough math, obviously, but if we can have small success on a 10x type of goal, then you start to see how not only can we start to extend the healthy human health span and lifespan, but we can also potentially buy ourselves time to figure out additional technologies to extend the lifespan and the health span further. And that kind of gets to what Aubrey de Grey talked about with, longevity, reaching longevity escape velocity, which we can talk about as well. But just to start, can you talk about the difference between this engineering on, damage focused approach versus existing fields of gerontology and geriatrics?
Yeah, great. And I love that concept of targeting the low-hanging fruit, the big wins, the 10x, because ultimately, aging is the elephant in the room. The diseases of aging are the symptoms of aging. What that means is that aging is like is producing Hydra's heads. If you have cancer, diabetes, heart disease, Alzheimer's, they're Hydra's heads. This mythical tale of Hydra. You chop off one of the heads, another one grows back. That's how it is with age-related diseases. Even if we cure all cancers, well, guess what? We may have reduced the global number of cancer deaths, but guess what? The number of deaths due to what's called Tauber's paradox doesn't actually change that much. It doesn't change at all because those deaths are redistributed amongst the remaining causes. So you cure cancer worldwide. Well, what happens? Alzheimer's rate increases, heart disease rate increases, and people, they live 1 or 2 years longer, but ultimately because of this underlying process of aging, they're still dying. And there's not a huge amount of benefit. So I absolutely agree that we need to target the big wins. And in this case, it's the damage that's leading to all of these diseases. Like, we now have evidence that cellular senescence is implicated in like literally probably 20 to 30 different age-related conditions, everything from diabetes, neurodegeneration, osteoporosis, arthritis. We see that the negative impact of having these senescent cells, these zombie cells, which are basically these death-resistant cells that through a paracrine fashion infect other cells nearby and turn them into zombie cells, in the same way that a zombie will eat another human and turn them into a zombie, and they release all these pro-inflammatory cytokines, interleukins, and so forth. And so it creates this inflammation, this chronic low-grade inflammation that we know is associated with a whole host of age-related conditions. So you're absolutely right in thinking that current medicine, geriatric medicine, for example, is kind of the wrong way to do things. And not only is it the wrong way in terms of conceptually, but it's also harder, right? Like if you never maintain your car and you just wait like 50 years, it's it's going to be very badly broken. Like, you're going to have problems across all the different systems, and possibly dysfunction in one system will affect the other system, and so on. I'm clearly not a mechanic, so forgive me for my description of the analogy. But the point is that nipping things in the bud, in other words, preventing the causes of the problem, is going to be a lot easier than allowing the problem to manifest for, in the case of human biology, 80 years, and then trying to reverse all that damage. Because if someone has cancer, of course you want to kill the cancer, but you also need to, fix the damage that's basically caused that cancer. Like, if you don't fix the underlying damage associated with the hallmarks of aging, that person will soon die. And obviously there are exceptions if we think about cancers in younger people, which are, by the way, extremely rare, like thousands of times less common than in the elderly. But in the vast majority of cases, like 99.9% of cases, aging is the key factor in cancer. And so this is why we actually see that cancer survivors, interestingly enough, they have accelerated aging, because ultimately, cancer actually contributes to that damage accumulation, So it's pretty unfortunate. You take a cancer therapy, you survive cancer, let's say in your 40s, but you've accumulated more damage based on the effects of the tumor and the cancer. And ultimately, this means you're more predisposed to those other age-related conditions. So if we take a step back and think about, okay, what's the goal of medicine? What's the goal of biomedicine? I mean, you've got to think that extending healthy human lifespan, and notice it's healthy human lifespan. We're not keeping 90-year-olds alive for longer. We're keeping people alive in the state of good health for longer. You've got to think that that has to play a central role. Like, what is the point of curing cancer if you're only allowing someone to live a couple of years longer only to die of another age-related disease? And yet, although this is so rational to think that we should be targeting the root cause, this is not how society operates. If you look at the funding that the National Cancer Institute receives, if we take the US, for example, and we compare that to the amount of funding that geroscience receives, and notice that I didn't say the NIA, the National Institute of Aging, because only a small portion of the funding of the NIA's budget actually goes towards targeting aging. The rest goes towards, managing aging or dealing with the consequences of aging and the psychology of aging, rather than actually trying to fix the thing. We can see that society has a huge bias towards solving cancer, curing cancer, curing Alzheimer's. And, I don't have any bias against these conditions. In fact, my mother died of cancer 4 years ago. So I'm very familiar with cancer and the devastation that it wreaks. But my main focus is, let's focus on the root cause, because curing cancer doesn't actually help society as much as most people think it does. And if we think about the trillions of dollars worldwide, the figure is $1 trillion worldwide for dementia, the trillions invested and trillions of dollars of expenditure on the age-related conditions that are not actually treating the root cause, it's quite astounding. Because you would think that if you have this one thing, or in this case, these 9 things, the 9 hallmarks of aging, if you have these 9 hallmarks of aging that are contributing to not only cancer, but heart disease, but Alzheimer's, but diabetes, osteoporosis, arthritis, and any other age-related disease you can think of, surely targeting that root cause is a more rational strategy than just allowing all these Hydra's heads to develop and then playing a game of whack-a-mole. You hit one mole and another one comes up. You solve the diabetes, well, guess what? The heart issues and the cardiovascular issues have emerged. So really, current medicine has a big problem, which is that it's not preventative. It allows the problem to manifest over many decades, and then we try desperately to solve the problem. But if you've got a 90-year-old, who has cancer, who has multimorbidity, maybe they have atherosclerotic plaques building up, they have cardiovascular issues, they've got early signs of subclinical neurodegenerative symptoms like early memory loss and so on. By the way, this description is basically my grandfather, who's 99 years old. He turns 100 this year, born in 1921. If you have this elderly person who has this multimorbidity, you can't just solve the individual conditions and expect the person to live longer. And we have good data to suggest that, right? So, if someone has all this underlying damage that's driving this multimorbidity, you can't just pick off the individual diseases and expect to have this radical change if you're not targeting the source of that damage, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting perspective on that. And you point out how, chopping off the different heads of the beast. I forget the Hydrus, maybe you called it. I'm not familiar with the fable myself, but it's relatively a futile effort versus attacking aging itself. And I think it's kind of interesting. You also mentioned how, there's this tremendous amount of funding that goes to this collection of some of the most prevalent aging related diseases, but very little funding that goes to aging. And I'm hopeful personally that over the course of my lifetime, I will see aging recognized as kind of the root of all of it. And hopefully, some of it will be funded hopefully by new people coming in and funding the research, but it may be that we need to reallocate some of the funding that's going towards some of these different causes to aging itself. And I think, while that might be somewhat controversial, like at face value, if you can get these, get certain people to buy into the premise and believe the concept that aging will not only help solve the issue that they care most about, but also this laundry list of other issues that people like them care with a similar amount of passion about, that might actually be the best um, path forward at the end of the day. Currently, of course, we don't have that situation. We have a very small amount of funding going into aging, which you pointed out. Even the money that is going to, like, the NIA, for example, isn't actually targeting the types of research and technology that we're talking about today. And a lot of this is to do with the pro-aging trance, which you brought up in the beginning. Can we dig in a bit more to describing what exactly the pro-aging trance is? I believe Aubrey coined the term in or before his book, perhaps, Ending Aging. And, not only describing the term, but maybe addressing a couple of the key kind of supports that people draw in that trance, which is, one, people say, well, if everyone lives forever, we're going to have these vast population issues, which then lead to climate issues. And maybe there's just not even enough room on Earth for all of us, aside from the energy issues, that'll result in climate crisis and everything like that. And people just kind of come up with all of that, category of responses. And then separately, there's also this concept that death gives meaning to life. And I would love to hear, I've personally kind of worked my way around that, but I would love to hear your perspective on why both of those are more so myths than kind of facts that we need to be, that should prevent us from seeking to slow and reverse aging.
Yeah, so there's a lot there, and just for your listeners' benefit, to give a more kind of quantitative kind of account of the funding situation. So the NIH, which is the National Institutes of Health in the US, they have a budget of approximately 45 billion. The NCI, which is the National Cancer Institute, their budget is 6 billion. The NIA, which is the National Institute on Aging, their budget is about 3.5 billion. But of the NIA's budget, about 100 million goes to actually trying to look at aging from a basic biology perspective and treat aging. So that kind of, I think if you do the maths, it's about 0.2%, if I'm not mistaken, of the total NIH's budget. And if you think about it, it's quite disproportionately small, given that this is the thing that kills 70% of people. In the US, it's more, because it's a developed nation. It's more like 80 or 90% of people. The thing that kills 80 or 90% of people only attracts 0.2% of the National Institutes of Health budget in terms of actually treating the root cause of the problem. So that's just something for you to think about. But also on the economic side, think about it from a broader system, like a broader scale. I was looking up yesterday the military budget of the US, and I think the military budget is close to 700 billion. Okay. So think about this. We spend 700, well, if you live in the US, your government spends $700 billion protecting, the country from threats and so on, but it spends 100 million, which is like thousands of times less on actually treating the thing that's killing most people. And you could make the argument that, well, if we didn't have the military expenditure, then a lot of more people may die of wars and so on. But you've got to think about the marginal utility. Like if for 1 year the US military budget was decreased by 1 billion, and that 1 billion was put to aging, that would be a tenfold increase in the geroscience budget. And given the budget is so small in comparative terms, that only 100 million, it seems quite rational that, if there's one thing killing 80% of people, you should probably put a lot more resources to fix that thing. But
let me butt in on the budgeting piece, because I actually have another tangential example that I think might be relevant and you might like to expand upon a little bit as well, is that, and then we'll get to the pro-aging trance. But COVID, you wrote in your article, is really, you can think about it as an aging related disease and an aging related and promoted pandemic, basically, because you have this situation where it's mostly people with either in old age or with comorbidities that are kind of exhibits of the type of damage that we're talking about. And those are the people that are dying at very high percentages, whereas the young and healthy have done relatively well. It certainly wouldn't be the pandemic that it is if it treated, or if it impacted old people and people with those comorbidities like it does youthful and in shape, healthy types of people. And you see how much money that we're spending on the pandemic. It's in the trillions. We're printing trillions of dollars at the very least, and taking these vast actions to counter it. One could argue that if anything, we should learn from this and spend a great deal on aging, so that the next time something like this might come around, we have a lot healthier of a population that's equipped to fight diseases such as this, along with the laundry list of things like cancer and Alzheimer's that people would be theoretically less subject to if they weren't aging quite as we do now.
Absolutely. COVID-19, for the most part, is the straw that broke the camel's back. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Two facts need to be true for someone to die of COVID-19. They need to have the virus, obviously, but they also need to be sufficiently immunocompromised and just compromised in terms of their physiology and their immunology, their immune response and so on, to the point where they can't effectively fight and kill off the virus and remove the virus. So the media and most people who think about COVID-19 focus on that first fact. Okay, who's getting the virus, right? How do we stop the spread of the virus? How do we lock down countries, and implement social distancing policies and so on to prevent people getting the virus? But this is only half the equation. The other half of the equation is how good a shape are people's immune systems? Because if we go back to this white mirror scenario that we kind of elucidated earlier in the conversation, whereby everyone is biologically 20 or 30. So imagine right now, every human being, so 8 billion people on Earth, are all biologically 20 or 30 years old. So they look like a 20 or 30-year-old, and whether they're 50 or 80 or 150 years old chronologically, they have the same body basically as a 20 or 30-year-old, because the damage that would normally occur has been ameliorated. So in this hypothetical world, this ageless population, COVID-19 isn't a global pandemic. Why is it not a global pandemic? It still spreads. And, there's some, I was looking into this the other day, there's some dispute over what constitutes a pandemic, but usually, according to the WHO, the severity of the consequences and the repercussions and the symptoms and so on are a factor. Now, if you have an ageless society whereby everyone in the population is 20 to 30 years old, COVID-19 isn't a global pandemic because the death rate is so exceedingly low. And in fact, really the only people who would be dying would be those who have very severe, compromised immune systems, right? So they maybe they have some from birth, some issue with their immune response, or they are like morbidly obese and they have some sort of problems there. But even so, if you are morbidly obese, one way to think of that is your aging is accelerated. So even in that case, with fat extirpation and with, other anti-aging therapies, even that could be addressed with anti-aging. But the bottom line is that the reason people die of COVID is not only due to COVID, it's due to the fact that their body can't fight it. And, for me, I had COVID living in the UK. It's pretty unsurprising given the, how many cases we had. But because I'm fairly young, I can fight it off, and it wasn't pleasant. But I also didn't die from it. And if you look at the mortality curve from COVID-19 across age brackets, the interesting thing is the doubling time of COVID-19 mortality across age. There's been research on this. It actually matches the all-cause mortality curve. And it's actually at the same level as something like pneumonia. Now, the death rate is higher than from the normal influenza, but the doubling rate is basically follows the same trajectory, which means that COVID-19 has been described as an emergent disease of aging. Yes, it's a communicable disease in the sense that, unlike something like diabetes, which is a non-communicable disease, or Alzheimer's or whatever, it's actually transferred from one person to another. But if we're thinking about mortality, it's an age-related disease, and it's a very clear trend that you see across the age demographics, that the older people are the ones who are dying. And I think there are, in many countries, there's a very interesting statistic that the average age of death from COVID-19 is actually higher than the average age of death nationally, which means that basically, if you think about things from an overall perspective, if it goes back to Tauber's paradox. It's like, if you have a vaccine that and you vaccinate everyone, sure, you reduce the number of COVID deaths, but guess what? You increase the number of cancer deaths and heart disease deaths and Alzheimer's deaths, because the people who would have been knocked off by COVID, this is why it's the straw that broke the camel's back, are now dying of something else, because the same aging process that results in immunosenescence and compromises their immune system, these hallmarks of aging, this damage accumulation that we've talked about, is now resulting in them dying of cancer or dying of another age-related disease. And I'm not even suggesting that vaccination is ineffective. I'm just saying that if our ultimate goal is to extend healthy human lifespan, we can't neglect the other half of the equation, which is, how do we boost people's immune systems? Not only how do we fight the virus, but how do we actually keep people younger so that not only can they fight the virus, but they also don't get cancer at near the same rate that they otherwise would. And it's very interesting because in the last year, there's been interesting clinical trials of senolytic drugs, these drugs that kill those zombie cells, those senescent cells, for COVID-19. And there's some good data coming out suggesting that, yes, if you kill senescent cells, which is basically an anti-aging approach that in mice extends lifespan up to 30 and 40%, and there's about 5 to 10 companies, biotech companies in the US that are trialing this in humans, various phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. There's evidence suggesting that these senolytic drugs actually can help to revive the immune system. Now, that may seem kind of strange, but the idea is that if you kill these pro-inflammatory cells, these senescent cells that are releasing all these inflammatory factors, you can basically restore the immune function, because chronic low-grade inflammation is actually bad for the immune system, to put it in simple terms. So there's very clear kind of mechanistic connections between things like between senescent cells, these zombie cells, and a weakening immune system. Now, we don't fully understand, it's worth pointing out, we don't fully understand how aging actually weakens the immune system. There are a few different kind of theories that are being explored, and a few different experimental designs that are being pursued, but we know that aging is the thing that is by far the biggest factor. So it's only a matter of time before we figure out, okay, why exactly is aging resulting in this COVID sort of mortality? In fact, that's actually a project I'm considering doing a bit of research on this year, a bit later in this year when I head back to Australia. So ultimately, senolytics could be beneficial not only to prevent cancer and prevent neurodegeneration, but also COVID-19, because you kill the senescent cells, you're kind of cleansing, or you're washing away all of these harmful zombie cells. As kind of pseudoscience as that sounds, it's real science. You can look it up. And then basically, the idea is that you're just able to extend healthy lifespan, and part of that means you're maintaining a solid and a robust immune function for a longer period of time. There are also other anti-aging approaches being pursued for COVID-19, such as metformin, which is a type 2 diabetes drug that's been used since the 1950s, which is an inhibitor of the mTOR pathway. So the idea there, without going into too much technical detail, is you're slowing down sort of your kind of metabolic processes in a way, and the mechanism of action of metformin is not fully elucidated, but you're basically attenuating this key mammalian aging pathway, and in so doing, you're allowing the immune system to kind of prosper and better fight COVID. And there's some good data that's come out recently about the use of metformin, which is this cheap off-patent drug for diabetes for COVID-19. So ultimately, I think when we think about COVID-19, I really want people to think of it as an age-related disease or an emergent disease of aging. You can phrase it in different ways, but basically to recognize the extremely strong, exponentially increasing rate of COVID-19 mortality with your age, your age bracket. Now, you might also say, well, okay, some young people don't die of COVID, but are they going to have long-term symptoms? And being at Oxford here and having some friends in immunology, I have taken a look at some of the data and discussed with some of the experts here, and we don't really know much about long COVID, but it could possibly be that a lot of the kind of symptomatology associated with long COVID is somewhat psychosomatic. Not to say it's all in the person's head, but that similar to something like irritable bowel syndrome or fibromyalgia, which produce real symptoms, though lack an observable and identifiable biological cause or kind of disease origin. It could be that long COVID is based on this biopsychosocial effect that we've seen as a result of all the doom and gloom in 2020, people being isolated, all these headlines about people dying, and this extremely negative environment and this isolation, and this biopsychosocial effect that this has, whereby social effects can influence your psychology, which can in turn influence your biology, to produce this kind of symptomatology associated with long COVID. Now, I should qualify this by saying, more research is needed, and it's quite possible that COVID-19 actually accelerates aging in the sense that it does have some long-term consequences. But even then, we still need anti-aging therapies, because if it's true that COVID-19, say, damages your lungs or has some other effects on your immune system, then we still need anti-aging to repair that damage. So the bottom line is that whether we're looking at non-communicable disease of aging, such as diabetes, Alzheimer's, and so on, or a communicable disease, which is also an emergent disease of aging, such as COVID-19, the bottom line is we have to start looking at repairing the damage that occurs over time, these hallmarks of aging, to keep people in a healthy, like a truly healthy state, not healthy for an 80-year-old, but healthy for a 20-year-old state, so that they can fight off these viruses. And unless we want to have another pandemic with COVID, 2021, COVID 2022, etc., we really need to bolster people's immune function so that we can fight off these diseases successfully.
Glad that we went down that tangent a little bit. I think it's very relevant, and people today, can really relate to the immediacy of the issue when you relate the issues of aging to COVID. I did bring up the question of like the pro-aging trance earlier. I think we've made, or you've made really a quite a compelling case on why aging deserves a lot more funding and attention. And ideally with those two things, we have a lot more acceleration of progress. Can we discuss the pro-aging trance and why that hasn't happened to date, and address some of those, primary concerns I brought up earlier, like the overpopulation, death brings meaning to life, those types of things?
Sure. So to go back to the question that you raised earlier, we can talk about this phenomenon, which Aubrey de Grey has pointed out, as you yourself mentioned, which is the pro-aging trance. This phenomenon by which people kind of delude themselves into thinking that aging is natural, or natural, normal, even good. It is natural, and you could say it's normal, but it's definitely not a good thing. Yet most of us from birth, we're conditioned to think of life as this kind of evolving process where, you're born, you go to school, you get a job, you retire, and then you live happily ever after. But guess what that happily ever after looks like? It looks like Alzheimer's disease. It looks like cancer. It looks like these age-related diseases that most people get in the world today. Even in Africa, the two leading causes of death are age-related conditions. That's what the happy ever after scenario looks like. If we strip away all of the kind of Disney fairy tale perceptions and we look at things objectively. So the question is, how do we as human beings respond to that psychologically? And there's some really interesting literature about learned helplessness and about terror management theory that is very relevant here. Okay, terror management theory, this idea that, when we're faced with the terror of our own mortality, we know that we're going to die of aging. if we don't have anti-aging technologies, which most people probably unaware of and don't think is feasible. So how do we respond to that? How do we respond to the fact that our biology, this organism upon which our conscious, our sentience, our consciousness is operating, kind of functionally and computationally and so on, that our consciousness exists in this biological animal, basically, this evolved ape that's going to die. How do we come to terms with that? And the thing is, and the answer is, well, it's difficult and we just ignore it. So I think the thing is that in different cultures, the way people think about aging and death, it does differ. In a lot of religious contexts, I think people, they deal with this by describing what may happen after you die. And I'm not one to question people's beliefs or whether it's true or not, but I think it is fair to say that it is a psychological way of dealing with the trauma of mortality and the horror of mortality. But in the West, we also just largely ignore it. Like, people don't really like to think about aging and death because it reminds them of their own imminent aging and death. You might think that, well, 80 or 90 years, which is, or 70, 80, 90 years, the average lifespan is quite a long time. But just talk to people in their 60s and 70s. A lot of them, from the inside, it doesn't feel that different from when you're 20. You've just been alive longer and you're a bit weaker, and you might have some health problems. You've gone through more, but you're the same person. And this is why I think when people are young, they think that something's going to happen in their life after which they're happy with dying. And even people in middle age, people hold on to these, and this also describes my own psychology to an extent. People think that if they get something, right, if they accomplish something, or if something happens, they'll be happy to die, right? But this isn't a reality. I mean, just spend some time on a cancer ward, and it's really interesting. When people get these terminal diagnoses, suddenly it's like they wake up from the trance. It's like, holy crap! This whole time I've just been going about life, as though I kind of live forever, and not really facing my own mortality. And then suddenly they're snapped into seeing the truth, and it's put right in front of their face, like, you are going to die very soon. And the thing is that actually applies to all of us. It's just the time scale is a bit longer, but it's still very, very, very soon in any kind of cosmological terms, or any kind of time scale you want to look at things. From the perspective of the universe, or even in the perspective of other animals. I mean, we're not even the longest living animal by a long shot. So the longest living animals include things like the green shark, which can live 400, 450 years, we believe. So compare our 70 or 80 year lifespan to a 450 year lifespan. I mean, we think we're kind of like the apex predator of Earth or whatever, but we actually have quite short lifespans. Even tortoises live 2, 3, 4 times longer than we do. So the thing is that we've got to really humble ourselves and see things objectively, and realize that we actually have pretty short lifespans. We undergo senescence, and we decline fairly rapidly after the age of 60, 70, 80. And we should try and do something about that, because aging sucks. And although we can kind of delude ourselves, which is this pro-aging trance, into thinking that aging is just something natural, it's kind of evolutionarily developed, or it's normal, or it's just an important part of growing up, or something like that, we've got to really check ourselves and check our priors and really question that premise. Because although existing chronologically, again, coming back to the distinction between chronological aging and biological aging, although existing chronologically is great, you get to live more, you get to self-actualize, you can spend more time with your friends, your loved ones, your family, etc. That's great. But biological aging, the physical decline that occurs basically, after the age of 20 till the time you die, this process of accumulating damage that will eventually kill you, that sucks. And I think as a society, we need to really wake up and think and be honest with ourselves and realize, okay, chronological aging, that's great. Biological aging, that sucks. Let's try and deal with that, rather than just conflating those two concepts of chronological and biological aging and pretending like they're the same thing. and then just having this fatalistic attitude of, well, this is just this thing that happens. We can't really do much about it. So let's just distract ourselves with our menial jobs or, our sports or whatever it is. And by the way, I have nothing against people's jobs or sports. I'm just saying that ultimately, in the face of your own mortality and the permanent erasure of your consciousness, if you take, materialism and computational functionalism seriously, I think a much more important priority at this stage is to secure a much longer lifespan. And this is what ties into this concept that you raised, Jake, about longevity escape velocity. This idea that at some point, most likely, and probably in the next 100 or so years, we're going to reach a point where everyone alive will basically be functionally immortal, not because we currently have the technology to bring us to that point, but that we will have therapies that will keep us alive long enough, say an extra 10 years, by which point better therapies will keep us alive for, say, 50 years, and so on. And so this is called longevity escape velocity, this idea that society reaches a point at which anti-aging technologies are good enough to keep us alive for a set amount of time, after which advances in the anti-aging research field allow us to live even longer, to the point where you can essentially survive indefinitely. Now, by the way, I was reading something really interesting, which was an analysis by some insurance companies, actually, that suggested that if we didn't have aging, the average lifespan would be somewhere between 2,500 and 8,000 years. So I thought that was quite an interesting kind of thing to think about. How old would we actually live to if there was no aging? Now, obviously, without aging, you can still die of other causes. You can die of a natural disaster. You can die because you're murdered, or you're in a conflict or something, or even infectious disease, although it's much less likely, or even cancer and so on. But again, because of the extremely strong role of aging, it's much less likely. So, but this is longevity escape velocity, and it's this idea that we live long enough to kind of benefit from these cures to aging, that even though they don't come within our natural lifetime, we can still reach that point based on therapies that do come within our lifetime. So basically, I think a really key concept for society to understand is this concept of longevity escape velocity, because when you frame your life in terms of, okay, there's actually a decent chance that I could live to 1,000 years old. So rather than spending my life trying to optimize for 80 years old and just trying to, have a family or play sports or entertain myself, whatever, for 80 years, why not try and do everything possible that I can to actually unlock that extra, 920 years of life, right? So this is kind of like a psychology that may be useful to some listeners. You've got to prioritize. What would you do if you had 1,000 years? Instead of having 80 years in your life, you had 1,000 years. Anything that you want to do that gives you value in life, you can do that, but you can do it better. You can do it for longer. And you might say, oh, it's greedy, it's hubristic. But really, the same argument would apply in the past 200 years when we extended our lifespan from 40 years in the 1800s, average lifespan, to 80 years today. Is it hubristic that we did that? Are we greedy for now living 80 years? Or is it just like way better that we get to live longer? And the same argument applies from 80 years to, say, 1,000 years. Is it greedy, or do we just like being alive? And this kind of nicely segues into a point that you raised, which is this notion that people raise, which is death or aging, brings meaning or happiness to life. Death brings meaning to life. And when you talk about anti-aging, a lot of people have this intuition that death is somehow good for us, like it gives our life a sense of purpose. Without death, life becomes meaningless. Who would want to live in a world without death? Now, this is actually quite absurd when you really think about it. If you're dead, how can that be meaningful? It's like life gives meaning to life, right? Like why do you have to die in order to give someone meaning in life? Take an example, right? Let's say you capture someone, you kidnap someone, and you say to them, okay, I want to make your life better and more meaningful, so I'm going to kill you in 2 years' time. that's that's essentially what people who make this argument are saying. They're saying that, like, okay, if I give you a sense of finality, your life will be better. But the thing is, I think, ironically enough, the reason why, if that were to be true, it would be true, is because it would force them to wake up from the pro-aging trance, which they can do without having to die anyway, right? Like, if people break free from this idea that, aging and death is a good thing, that naturally is going to allow them to, kind of, focus on the things that really matter. And that's why you see things like, when people have a cancer diagnosis, suddenly a lot of their trivialities in life and frivolous concerns kind of evaporate, because they realize, oh shit, I'm alive now. That's not going to be something that exists forever. But the key point is that realization can take place without having the cancer diagnosis or without having death. Like, you can just kind of wake up. And so how do you wake up? Well, maybe you reflect, you meditate, you think thoughtfully about things, you understand your place in the universe, and you do a bit of philosophizing and so on, and you kind of see what's valuable in life. But to say that you need to end someone's conscious existence in order to bring meaning to their life is absurd. Life brings meaning to life. Death does not bring meaning to life.
Yeah, another way to wake up might just be to listen to this podcast. I think it's been for people who come into it open-minded, it's shed a lot of light and hopefully brought some hope to people who just thought that there was no possible way of living meaningfully longer. To realize that actually, if we attack aging and give it the proper funding and attention and global effort, it's actually a reasonable idea that we could live to 150 years old, 200 years old, 500, 1,000 years old, whatever it might be. Um, Briefly, I want to touch on the overpopulation thing as well. We don't need to go too deep into it, but I heard something kind of interesting today. I was listening to a conversation with Jeff Bezos. He's obviously got Blue Origin going into space, and he talks about how part of that is because he wants to bring industry off of Earth and into space as kind of like a climate type of effort to preserve Earth. And he talks about how humans biologically we use metabolically, I suppose we use about 100 watts of energy per day. But in the developed world now, the average person uses about 11,000 watts of energy per day. And that amount has basically been compounding for over 100 years and figures to continue doing so. And so my counter to the overpopulation argument, just thinking about that thing that I heard earlier today, is basically, and so he basically said, if we wanted to have enough energy for everyone in 100 or 200 years, if we continue to compound at that low single digit rate from like 11,000 watts per person that we are at today, if you wanted to provide enough energy for those people, you couldn't do so by covering the entire Earth's surface with, solar panels. And so my counter to the overpopulation piece is like, first of all, we're working on things like space. We're working on counters to the climate crisis. And, solving aging alone, sure, that probably isn't a perfect solution, but there's no reason not to pursue it while we work on these other dimensions at the same time, because we're going to need to solve the climate crisis separately, whether we, reverse or slow aging or not. We have a population that's increasing and energy needs that are increasing. And so the overpopulation concern strikes me as somewhat arbitrary. Um, Second to that, I want to, touch back on the point that you made about like kind of going back to the budgeting thing, I suppose. And I think from my perspective, and let me know if you have kind of any points to add here, but obviously I would, if my goal was to extend the human health span, which is just, I think a term which combines increasing lifespan with also not the concept of like being 80 forever in terms of like what the biological age that we associate with the chronological age of 80, but being like 20 or 30 biologically for an extended number of years. So I would focus a number of, the vast majority of our budget on solving aging, but then secondarily, I would put a lot more money into like autonomous vehicles, which, cars and road traffic accidents are the leading cause of death for people who essentially don't have leading causes of death, which are related to aging. So like 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds. Other ones, like you mentioned, how long could people live if they didn't have aging? And what would kill them? Maybe like homicides and things like that. So mental health may be a good area to kind of allocate some funding there for not only homicides, but suicides, which are also near the top of the list of leading causes of death outside of aging for people in young age. And then lastly, you talked about how we've transitioned from, being like the average lifespan was like 40 to 80, and the same logic for why that was good should apply beyond. A large piece of how we were able to get there was by reducing child morbidity, and that would be like a fourth bucket where I would allocate some funding. Is this kind of a better structure? That's just my perspective, but is this a better structure from your perspective to kind of extending the human health span?
Yeah, so a lot of really great points there. And I want to start by completely agreeing with your rebuttal to overpopulation. Like you said, the problem we have is not like we do have a problem with overconsumption, but the goal is not to like kill people, right? Imagine if people looked at COVID-19 and said, okay, we're actually going to let COVID-19 kill as many people as possible so that we can reduce our carbon footprint. Like, imagine how absurd that would be, because that's basically the argument that people are using when they're saying, "Oh, we should allow aging so that we kill enough people so that our emissions are low or our food production doesn't become too vast." And if you think about it, it's an absurd argument, right? So as you said, the actual solution is to use technology to help us sustain a larger population size. And by the way, that's what's already been happening since Thomas Malthus initially came up with this whole premise of overpopulation. These are neo-Malthusian concerns and this idea of like neo-Malthusian collapse, this idea that the population grows exponentially to the point where there's not enough resources to provide for everyone. And that's been debunked. And the way that we've seen that being kind of invalidated over the past couple of hundred years is because technology improves to help us sustain a larger population. An interesting fact is that we would actually be overpopulated today if we were on hunter-gatherer technology. But because we have better technology, we have agriculture and so on, we can sustain a much larger population. But there's a few other points I'll touch on regarding overpopulation. The first thing is that population is actually, a lot of people think that population is just exponentially increasing. And if you look at the historical graph of population size, you might infer that looking at the graph. But actually, because of the demographic transition model, it's actually the case that the population, according to WHO and so on, the population size is predicted to peak at somewhere between 10 to 11 billion people, somewhere between 2050 and 2100 under the status quo. And actually a much bigger problem that we have today, and countries like Japan and Italy are already experiencing this, is this idea of dependency ratios being unfavorable, which means it's not so much how many people you have, it's the ratio of the elderly people to the younger people. Now, the crucial point is that when we talk about the elderly, I'm talking about biologically older people, because if you're, say, in your 70s, 80s, 90s, and you're not able to support yourself, you're not able to work, etc., because you don't have that cognitive capacity or the energy and so on, just because of your aging, then having a population where most people are in that state is quite challenging. And that's what a lot of Asian countries, certainly Japan and China in the near future as well, are really likely to suffer from, even in the West, because of the baby boomer generation. As the baby boomers get older, suddenly you have a huge bulk of the population who are undergoing biological aging. They're having to retire. They're having to kind of, be supported by the healthcare system as they develop multiple morbidities associated with the aging process. And so, the dependency ratio is a really critical factor. Now, the good news is that solving aging, or not even solving aging, but just retarding the aging process and extending healthy lifespan helps with this issue. I mean, it helps to deal with this issue, because if you have people in their 60s who are as healthy as people today who are in their 30s or 40s, suddenly they're not a burden on the healthcare system. Suddenly they're capable of, working as much as they used to because they feel like they did when they're 30. Not only from the inside, but like physically they're able to work. Yeah. And today with the current economy, you see a lot of people transitioning multiple times in their career into different career paths and different jobs, and even into their older age. People have some interest in doing that, but because of biological aging, it becomes harder and harder. Like if you're in your 80s today, it's going to be hard for you to start a biotech company, right, or a technology startup. Why is that? Well, you've suffered neurodegeneration to some extent, which is just part of normal aging, or even what we'd call healthy aging. I mean, it's inevitable. Some of my friends here, they look at the brains of people who have Alzheimer's disease and the brains who have people, the brains of people who have been quote unquote healthy. They both have signs of, amyloid plaques and so on. So, there's no way of escaping neurodegeneration, even with the best dietary protocols and so on. Again, which is why we need the anti-aging therapies. But basically, going back to my original point, we need to enable people to remain healthy for longer, right, in order to escape these issues of dependency ratios. So that's a couple of ways to look at overpopulation. The population is actually predicted to peak at about 10 to 11 billion and then decline. And this is because the areas of high growth at the moment are Southeast Asia and Africa, both of which are areas that as they develop in terms of their economic development, according to the demographic transition model, we see that as countries develop, birth rates decline. So although birth rates are fairly high now and their population growth is quite high, that is, if you look at the trends across all the countries in the world, that kind of tapers off. As the country develops, birth rates fall, and then the population size stabilizes. So although it looks like population of the world is just exponentially increasing, it's actually on track to kind of plateau at around 2050 to 2100 at around 10 to 11 billion and then decline. Now, with anti-aging technology, it does change things. And to the extent that we can extend healthy lifespan, the population size will grow at a faster rate. Or in other words, after 2100, it'll decline at a slower rate than it would otherwise have. And it's interesting to note that Elon Musk actually mentioned in his interview at the Axel Springer Awards recently that underpopulation is actually likely to be a bigger problem than overpopulation in the near future. He also gave a shout out to solving aging in that interview, which you can look up. But anyway, I digress. So the point is that if we are able to slow aging, a lot of the resource issues, as you correctly pointed out, we're going to have to solve anyway, because of the unsustainable levels of consumption. So we don't have to kill people, right, by not solving their aging and allowing them to die of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, in order to solve that problem. In the same way that we wouldn't allow people to die of COVID-19 in order to reduce the carbon footprint of a country. Like that would be an absurd policy. So neo-Malthusian collapse is basically a myth. And another fun fact about sort of overpopulation is in 2012, there was this team from the Per Square Mile project led by Tim Deschamps, and they produced this infographic to show sort of like how many people could fit into regions of the earth. And if populated as densely as New York, the entire world's population could fit into an area the size of Texas, right? Think about that. If populated as densely as New York, the entire world's population could fit into an area the size of Texas, right? So actually, it's not like we're going to run out of space, right? And then we're also going into space with Elon Musk's company, SpaceX, and with Blue Origin and so on, Bezos's company. So we also have potentially colonies on Mars in the future and so on. So really, it's just a red herring. This idea that the world is going to get overpopulated and that we're all going to be, dying of starvation, it's just not the case. We have the resources. It's just about efficiently allocating them and, developing technologies to better allow them to be efficiently allocated. And, we could talk about food production. We could talk about CO2 emissions. I mean, if we look at the CO2 emissions of the US versus Portugal, two developed countries that have equivalent kinds of living standards and quality of life, but Portugal emits less than, I believe, 1/3 the CO2 per capita than the US, right? Because they have more renewables, it's just more efficient and so on. So, we don't have to have high levels of CO2 emissions. We just need to, organize things in a way and, align the incentives and so on to incentivize renewables and to use technology, geoengineering and so forth to solve some of these issues, as you said. And then finally, something interesting you mentioned was about sort of mental health, because let's say in the future, we've solved aging, and we have solved car crashes, maybe with autonomous vehicles and so on. And then what are people dying of? Let's say they're dying of murders, and let's say I can't confidently talk about the influence of mental health on murder, but I think the influence of mental health on suicides definitely could be a large factor. But here's a fun fact for you. Guess which age bracket has the highest rate of depression and suicides? It's the elderly. You can look this up. Actually, a lot of people think that, depression and, these sorts of conditions occur in like younger people, but actually the highest rates of depression, and this is something I learned in my neuroscience course at Oxford, right? We had lectures about, geriatric psychiatry. The highest rates of depression are in the elderly, and the highest rates of suicide are in the elderly, especially men. But the point is that society actually sweeps this under the carpet. And unfortunately, a lot of those suicides in the elderly are misclassified as euthanasia, even though they don't meet the criteria for euthanasia. So I think it's fair to say that if you're undergoing neurodegeneration, if you're losing your memories, if you're forgetting who you are and you're not able to function, that is correlated with depression. And there's very strong indications in the data for that. And it makes sense, right? If you're losing your mind because of aging, and again, this happens in healthy aging. Again, my friend here at Oxford who works in an Alzheimer's lab, she's literally looked at the brains of deceased people who are quote unquote healthy and have Alzheimer's, and they both have signs of amyloid plaques, right? They both have these hallmarks of Alzheimer's, because it's just part of aging. Like you can't age and you can't live to 90 years old and have no signs of neurodegeneration. It's not possible, because those underlying hallmarks of aging are causing this accumulation of damage that's ultimately driving these pathologies in the brain. So the point is that if we want to improve mental health, I genuinely think that getting rid of aging is a good step. It's not the only thing. I think we also need other strategies. And I think I'm quite confident that things like VR could play a big role. There's some interesting work being done with VR for, overcoming trauma and social anxiety and that sort of thing. So I'm quite optimistic about that sort of approach. But also things like psychedelics for depression. There's a lot of new companies and exciting work in that space. And even, unknown unknowns. I believe that there's going to be psychopharmaceuticals, as well as, possibly even more speculatively, brain computer interfaces such as Neuralink and open water that will allow us to basically, with the press of a button, maybe this is 30, 40, 50 years off, with the press of a button, basically turn off anxiety or turn off depression. As in, we have a program that's basically like an EEG, but much more powerful, and has hundreds of thousands, if not millions of nodes that can basically identify the patterns of brain activity associated with anxiety or depression, and then basically produce electrical signals in such a way that it can actually kind of untrain us out of those thought patterns. I know that sounds quite speculative, but I do think something like that will happen, or we will have better psychopharmaceuticals that are like psychedelics, but with less side effects and even more potent, and that can target these sort of pathways associated with anxiety and depression. And interestingly, this is actually why I switched out of neuroscience and am more interested in aging, because the bottom line is your mental health doesn't matter if you're dead, right? Now, currently the thing that's killing most people is aging, so I'm focused on that. But guess what? When we solve aging, and the number one cause of death is suicides, then hell yeah, I'll go back into neuroscience and try and stop people from committing suicide. Because ultimately, I think, however we can, get rid of death and just keep people alive and able to live their life without having to worry about death, I think it's one of the most important priorities for humanity.
So let's talk a little bit more about the brain machine brain machine interface concept. We talked about longevity escape velocity as being a path towards where we could have theoretically we could have immortality. Cryonics is another avenue that people, they may not think that in their lifetime we can kind of have longevity escape velocity, so they may pursue cryonics as a way to be able to kind of be revived and alive when we get to the point where we can kind of achieve significantly longer health spans at the very least. How do all of these other, there's also like the mind uploading concept. How do those, cryonics, mind uploading, brain machine interface, those different kind of categories tie in to this more, scientific focused aging conversation from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I guess one potential rebuttal to what I'm suggesting about curing aging is, well, and maybe some readers may find this quite a strange concept, but why do we need to solve aging if we could just upload people's brains or something like that? Now, just to give a bit of background, this idea of brain or mind uploading, it seems quite speculative, but if you take computational functionalism and materialism seriously, which are these philosophical ideas in the philosophical area of inquiry of philosophy of mind, which are these ideas that basically the brain is made up of physical stuff, atoms, neurons, etc., and the computational processes that occur within the brain basically create this simulation that we live in, this consciousness, right? Allow us to experience something. So we exist within this kind of consciousness that's running on the operating system of our brains. And the idea is that we can kind of recapitulate that same program, that software that our consciousness exists on a computer. And, there's a lot of philosophy of mind associated with, well, would that really be you? Like if I scanned your brain now and put you in a computer, but you're still alive now, would the one in the computer, the version of Jake on the computer, still be you? That's kind of an open question in philosophy. And there's actually quite a lot of disagreement amongst academic philosophers about this kind of old transhumanist question of, will you still be you if you get your mind uploaded? So for me personally, the reason I'm very interested in aging is because I think it's such a low-hanging fruit. Like, I think in terms of mind uploading, we need to do a bit more research and to understand consciousness better and to, progress those sorts of fields forward before I think we can just confidently say that, yep, we can just upload 8 billion people's minds and we can live forever. I think that there are a lot of steps that need to happen before that situation. And I think the lowest hanging fruit, even if we want that situation to come eventually, is just to stop people dying of aging. I mean, we have 100,000 people dying per day of aging. And obviously those people, especially if they're not being cryonically preserved, and even more so if they have neurodegeneration, it's very unlikely that we're going to be able to bring them back, right? So the question is, well, how do we get as many people who are alive today to make it to longevity escape velocity, or even to make it to a point where we can achieve some kind of immortality, hopefully, or at least some way to live a much longer life, so we don't have to be restricted by the kind of biological limitations that we are currently bound by. So I think something like cryonics. Now, I interviewed Aubrey de Grey, like you did recently, for the Oxford Aging Society, and I asked him about cryonics because that was a question that came up. And Aubrey de Grey, he's a big proponent of cryonics, but he actually, because he's quite bullish and quite optimistic about longevity escape velocity timelines, in the sense that he thinks we will probably reach longevity escape velocity by around 2036, which means people who are alive in 2036 will be alive to benefit from therapies that will then allow them to live long enough to benefit from even better therapies to, ad infinitum, to exist basically forever until they die of something else. But even despite his quite optimistic projections of longevity escape velocity with that 2036 estimation, which he estimates with 50% probability, he actually still thinks cryonics is important, especially for people who are old now, right? Because if we take seriously, well, if we look at the data and we see that 37 million people die per year, I mean, if we're talking about 2036, that's almost, if my maths is correct, 500 million people. Yeah, that would be potentially more than 500 million people would die, even in those 16 years between, well, 15 years now between 2021 and 2036. So for those 500 million people, that's kind of we want to save as many of those people as possible. And the way we do that is by accelerating anti-aging so that we can get these therapies into the world sooner, so that we can save those people. Because if we can push longevity escape velocity as early as possible, in other words, if we can develop therapies to keep us alive long enough to essentially live forever, to be functionally immortal, if we can push that date earlier and earlier and earlier, it means that a lot of these people who otherwise would have been dead forever, dead, gone, will now make that cut. Because think about this, right? Who wants to be in the last generation to die? Imagine you're 90 years old, right? You're 90 years old and you have a terminal cancer diagnosis, and you watch the news and you see that scientists are saying that in 2 years' time, we're going to have successful anti-aging therapies, but it's too late for you, right? How depressing would that be to be in the last generation to die, to know that after you, other people are going to live forever, but you're going to die and that's going to be it, right? That's extremely depressing. And we really don't want that situation. So how do we avoid that? The way we avoid it is we invest heavily now. We get anti-aging therapies. We get as many people to make the cut as possible. I mean, ultimately, it's like a game theoretic situation. If we all prioritize our own lives, and no one really contributes to anti-aging, then we're all going to die. Like, all of the 8 billion people on Earth will die. But if we all kind of band together and we take anti-aging seriously and we really try and accelerate this research, knowing that it's in our best interest because we're all screwed if we don't do it, then we can actually get these therapies. Like, if you really look at the science and you look at how much progress we've made, even with the small amount of funding that we have had in this field, it's quite remarkable. And if you scale that up a few orders of magnitude, and then you think about, what we could achieve in terms of being able to retard the aging process, basically repair the hallmarks of aging and so on, there's pretty good reason to think optimistically, to be optimistic and think that we could get this technology fairly soon, right? How soon? We're not sure, but surely we should try and get it as soon as possible, given that 100,000 people per day are dying, and every day sooner we get this technology represents 100,000 lives saved. So ultimately, I think cryonics is definitely possibly useful for people who are older now, especially. Because if you're in your 70s or 80s now, you may not live long enough to reach a time in history, in the future, in which we have anti-aging therapies. So cryonics, this idea of kind of freezing your body and with the hope to be revived in the future, is probably a safe bet. Now, for those who don't know much about cryonics, I recommend the waitbutwhy.com overview of cryonics. It explains it very well. But basically, the premise of cryonics is that when we classify someone as legally dead today, that doesn't mean that in the future, that point of degradation will represent biological death. In the same way that if we go back 100 years, if someone has a heart attack and they were considered dead in that time period, in today's time period, they're no longer considered dead because we have defibrillators, we have CPR, etc. We can revive them. And the idea is that in the future, even if we have things like cancer, because I think cancer is actually a harder problem in many ways than slowing aging, in the future, when we can actually kind of very easily remove all cancers, then someone who maybe died of cancer, you could unfreeze their body and repair their body, bring them back to life. Now, that is more speculative, and I don't place a lot of confidence in cryonics working. A lot of estimates from experts are in the range of, they have like a middle kind of normalized distribution with a median value of around 5 to 10% probability that cryonics works. And personally, I don't want to really risk my life and the life of all my loved ones and everyone on Earth I don't want to put a 5% probability of success on that, and that's what cryonics is. So that's why I think anti-aging is a much better strategy, because it's 100%. Like, if your anti-aging is working, there's no uncertainty about it. You don't have to, be asleep in cryostasis for 100 years and then hope to wake up. You're just awake the whole time. So I think ultimately in the long-term future, maybe 1,000 years or whatever it is, something like Neuralink that can safely upload our minds in a way that can be we can reliably be sure is still us and preserves our identity. I think, that would be great. That would be cool. But I think the much more pressing problem, as far as I can tell, is the fact that we have 37 million people, which is the size of Canada, dying every year of aging, and it's such a low hanging fruit. Even if we don't fully solve aging, we can at least get therapies to get most of those people who would otherwise have died of aging to live long enough to benefit from these possible futures in which we have mind uploading or some other kind of brain preservation and so on.
Right. So you talked about Aubrey's estimate of 15 years, maybe reaching longevity escape velocity. I, like you, it sounds like to take kind of a conservative approach to these issues, because if you start getting into kind of these out there seeming issues and you don't take a conservative approach, on the one hand, you lose a lot of people, and on the other hand, it's probably just like not, I don't know, it's just not my personal approach to things. So I'll take Aubrey's 15-year estimate, and I think what Aubrey's doing is awesome. Don't want to take anything away from that, but I'll just take a more conservative view and say, okay, well, what if it takes twice as long as Aubrey thinks? And so 30 years from today instead of 15. And at that point, I'm like, I'm closer to like in my middle age, let's say that. And then, if it takes three times what Aubrey says, 45 years, then I'm like 70 years old. And at that point, it may be like almost too late to apply some of these technologies or whatever it is. So if I want to do kind of the best things that I can do to be alive and relatively healthy and somewhat eligible for the various therapies and treatments at the point at which we may or may not reach longevity escape velocity, if that's in 15 years or 30 years or 45 years, whatever it might be. I know there's certain things that I think about as like my personal health and longevity strategies. And they're not like super out there, like, exercise is maybe first and foremost, but would love to hear kind of your perspective on what some of your personal strategies are on being kind of alive and well at the point where we may reach some of these therapies and be able to, bring reinforcements on living longer and healthier lives. And then, after that, we can wrap up the conversation with talking a little bit about what got you into all this in the first place.
Yeah, cool. So just to clarify Aubrey's prediction, so he gave 50% probability estimation of reaching longevity escape velocity by 2036, but he also assigned a 10% probability that we won't have reached it by 2100. So I think, as you've suggested, there is a conservative view that we won't have these technologies for a while. And I think if we live in that sort of world, I think the most likely reason for that are things like the pro-aging trance and people's unwillingness to actually accept that aging is a bad thing and a bad thing that we can solve. And that's why, the work that you're doing and many people who are trying to promote the science and people in the field who are doing the science are doing is so important, because we need to accelerate the timelines as much as possible. Because if we don't, everyone alive today, the 8 billion people alive today, will all die, and they'll be permanently gone, like the 100 billion humans who existed before us. So moving on to kind of personal longevity strategies. Now, there's kind of two schools of thought. So one school of thought is what Aubrey de Grey kind of proposes, which is basically there's not a lot you can do now besides what your mother would have told you, and that the best thing you can do is just try and promote the field. So Aubrey's answer would probably be, instead of buying a lot of supplements, instead of trying to pursue the best and most expensive anti-aging technology that we have today, you would be better off probably, just telling your friends and family to donate to SENS Research Foundation, which is a charitable organization in the US that kind of finances some of these research projects and this field of geroscience, in order to basically get better therapies that will completely overshadow anything that we have today. So, I mean, today we think things like exercise and good diet are fairly important, and they are for today's standards. But if we go in 100 years' time and we have some nanotechnologies that can instantly remove all our atherosclerotic plaques, which is something that people are working on at the moment, and we have all these other technologies that can, repair all the damage of the hallmarks of aging, then in that kind of situation, exercise doesn't really matter. Like, you won't have to exercise, because all of the benefit of exercise you can basically artificially accomplish. So that's one school of thought, right? So Aubrey de Grey school of thought is basically, you don't need to worry too much and get obsessive about anti-aging strategies or taking all kinds of supplements, because in the long run, what's going to make a much bigger difference is whether we actually progress the field. So I think there's some merit to that. And I think most people, if they are serious about living a very long life, I think at least being aware of the field and maybe telling a few of their friends and family and colleagues and so on is probably a good thing to do, because I think it's sort of like, once we have a critical mass of society who cares about this problem, then you have funding, the government has to take it more seriously, and, the NIA's budget and the geroscience budget kind of increases, and suddenly you start seeing more rapid development. And when you see like kind of more consumer interest, the market is going to drive a lot more kind of developments on the biotech side. But anyway, so that's one approach. Now, the other approach, which is the approach of someone like my friend Sebastian Brunmeier, who's a longevity biotech VC, who's co-founded 2 longevity biotech companies. His approach is to basically try and do both, right? Like, you want to try and progress the field, but you also want to focus on personal longevity strategies. Now, he knows the science a lot better than I do, and I've just got a document in front of me that has some of his protocol. So why don't I go through some of the things on his protocol, because I would defer my sense making on personal longevity strategies to Sebastian, because he's a lot more knowledgeable in this area. But I'll just go through a few of the things here. I mean, daily multivitamin, omega-3, turmeric, resveratrol, metformin, quercetin, NR, which is nicotinamide riboside, vitamin D, vitamin C, B12. And in terms of lifestyle, intermittent fasting, carbohydrate reduction, low stress exercise, so walking, biking, swimming, a bit of strength training, omega-6 reduction, animal product reduction, 8 to 9 hours of sleep, stress reduction, sunlight exposure. And that's sort of, there's some of the main things that he does. And because he's much more deeply familiar with some of the research and has been involved in the field for much longer than I have, I would defer my recommendations to him. But by the way, this is obviously not a medical, it doesn't substitute medical advice, but those are just some things you can start looking into. So if you want to, just go back in the recording, just have a look at some of those compounds that I mentioned, start Googling them, learning about them. I think also David Sinclair's book, Lifespan, has some really good suggestions for basic strategies that you can employ today to extend your healthy lifespan. And I also think they're fairly robust as well. And they largely overlap with what Sebastian has suggested here. So to summarize, there's the Aubrey de Grey approach, which is, do whatever you want because it's not going to matter. And I know Aubrey has publicly stated that, he doesn't really sleep that much. But he actually is lucky that he has quite a low biological age for his chronological age, which he's had measured. But I think someone like David Sinclair or Sebastian would probably promote a more proactive approach to anti-aging, which involves, exercising, meditation, stress reduction, sleeping, dieting, and taking certain supplements. David Sinclair is a big proponent of metformin and resveratrol, and NAD precursor molecules such as NMN. So so I think those are some of the main things to think about. I think to learn more about this field, because it's such a new field, and a lot of people won't have learned about it, I think reading David Sinclair's book called Lifespan, Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to, is probably the best kind of manual, like introductory manual to anti-aging. And then from there, you can start looking into resveratrol, metformin. There's a lot of companies now like Do Not Age that produce these sorts of compounds that you can purchase.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a helpful overview, and obviously people can do their own diligence and maybe read David's book or explore some of the alternatives that you pointed out. I want to close out our conversation. I mean, it's been a fascinating talk about aging and how we can all live healthier and longer. I think this is hopefully going to be a great conversation and interview for a lot of people to listen to. And if you come in with an open mind, I think it might change a lot of people's minds. But I want to end on how you came to be interested in aging in the first place. And in talking before this conversation, you told me something pretty interesting. I mean, on the one hand, you talked about how you see life as an optimization problem with two variables, one being subjective well-being and the other being longevity. And obviously now we're talking about mostly the latter. But I understand you have a lot of experience, to say the least, with meditation. And I don't know if you're comfortable sharing kind of the practice and actually how long you've meditated in terms of like time in the day, but would love to hear about how kind of all of that led you to where you are today, working on aging. And then if you don't mind expanding on the meditation practice a bit, because I know when you told me about it, it was something that stood out as highly unusual. And I think on this podcast, at least, I like to talk to people about their most unusual habits, because I think they're oftentimes some of the most interesting. So would love if you could kind of touch on all that.
Yeah, sure. The first thing I'll say is I definitely wouldn't say I'm an expert at meditation, although I have thought a lot about the role of meditation and other sort of, Buddhist practices, but also other psychological practices that you'd find in trauma therapy. I mean, here at Oxford, we have some of the best trauma researchers in the world, and other CBT techniques. And basically, optimizing your psychology using a lot of these practices. If we really simplify life, now this is a gross simplification, but I think some of the most important things are, how good do you feel? This is kind of hedonistic utilitarianism. Like, how much psychological well-being do you have? And then how long do you have that for? That is broadly what most of us on some level are seeking. Now that can manifest in all kinds of ways. People are interested in sports or in relaxing on the beach or being with family or being productive and so on, but some kind of psychological well-being. And then I think another factor that is important is longevity, because you could have a great life, but if you die when you're 10 years old, that's somehow not as good or not as meaningful as if you, at least for that person, as if they were to have lived to, say, 70 or 80, because they have more time to self-actualize. Maybe they learn more about themselves in their 20s. And so even if they die when they're 10 years old, they haven't actually experienced life as fully as they could otherwise have. So then in my case, I just spent a lot of time thinking about, okay, I exist within this simulation created by my brain, which is basically this emergent phenomena that comes out of the computational processes in my brain. And okay, what am I trying to achieve? Well, in the past, I ran a business, and there's different games that we play, right? Like in academia, people are playing a game where they want to get as many publications as possible and citations and be respected in their field. In business, people are playing a game where they're trying to, raise as much revenue as they can for their companies and so on. So there's all these different games in life, but I tried to think about, what game do I want to play and why do I want to play it? Because I was in business before, and I've spent a little bit of time in academia. But ultimately, I think, these games just serve us a deeper underlying kind of goal that we have on some level, which is to feel good. We just want to feel good. And when I thought about this problem, and when I started thinking about all of these neuropsychiatric conditions that I studied in my master's, depression, anxiety, bipolar, as well as neurodegeneration and so on, I think what I concluded is that, overcoming all trauma and trying to work through, your deepest kind of like basically I don't want to say flaws, but aspects of your psychology that are limiting you from optimizing your well-being, which is not a single thing, but requires, in my opinion, different angles. So I do think there is a role in, even from religious teachings, not even if you don't think the religion is correct, I do think there's a role for using religious teachings to kind of optimize your psychological well-being across different conscious states. And this isn't something I've written a lot about, so I can't really give a very robust explanation of this. But I think certain practices, spiritual practices, they can provide certain levels of existential calm and so on. And, ironically, it's kind of part of the pro-aging trance. So I don't endorse it at the expense of rationality. But in terms of improving psychological well-being, I think it can be quite useful. And personally, I found that especially a lot of practices from Buddhism, basically realizing that most suffering comes from attachment. Like, why are you unhappy now? Because you're a little bit hungry, you've got an attachment to that, because you would like a slightly higher paid job, or because you're unhappy with this friendship or this work colleague. There's all these attachments we have. We want the world to be in a way that's different from how it currently is. And that's basically what the Buddha 2,000 odd years ago said. He said, if you're attached, you will suffer. If you let go of all your attachments, you won't suffer as much and you'll feel better. And in my case, when I'd known about Buddhism for a while, but when I started actually practicing it and actually kind of following some of the steps that the Buddha recommended to actually let go of some of these attachments, I noticed that the marginal utility of my psychological well-being improved much faster using this approach than any other approach. For example, if I earned like 10% more revenue with my business back in 2018, 2019, that didn't really affect my well-being that much. But if I meditated 10% more, that had like a proportionate increase in my psychological well-being. This was the observation that I noted. So to me, it just seemed like, well, really, all you need to be extremely happy is these practices. Now, I'm talking about the Buddhist practices, but there's also very valuable aspects of trauma therapy, books like Body Keeps the Score, and things like that. Even some of the work by Anki Eulers at Oxford. She's one of the most, has also been quite a big influence, and having lectures from her and talking to her in my course has been quite a big influence. But basically, I think, understanding your psychology and adopting certain practices such as Buddhist practices and meditation, I do think is one of the most robust ways of improving psychological well-being. That said, I understand why a lot of people wouldn't want to do that, because it involves doing things that are challenging and that people don't like doing. Letting go of things that you've held on to your whole life is actually quite an emotionally challenging thing to do, which is why a lot of people don't like doing it. And it does actually involve somewhat letting go of parts of your identity. It doesn't feel good when you're introspecting and you're seeing all these attachments you've held on to your whole life to certain ideas about yourself and how you'd like the world to be. I've always viewed myself as this. I've always wanted this. And then you see that thought actually creates suffering. And then the only way to kind of resolve that is not to get the thing, which will temporarily provide a fix for you, only to later attach to something else, but to actually systematically uproot and remove all those attachments. I think that approach is not appealing to us in the West because of how our culture has evolved, and materialistic pursuits and so on. But I think objectively, if we track our subjective well-being and we kind of correlate the extent to which we follow and adopt these sort of practices with how good we feel, in my opinion, it seems to work. And it seems to work with a pretty strong correlation that leads me to think that it's causative. But other people can try it for themselves. And interestingly enough, this is what the Buddha actually said himself 2,000 years ago. The Buddha actually said, try these practices. If they work, great. If they don't work, then you don't have to use them. And so, and that's kind of what I like about Buddhism, is that it is a lot of the teachings, the core psychological teachings, are completely compatible with a secular worldview. You don't have to necessarily adopt any sort of belief or dogma to improve your psychological well-being. And you might say that, well, it's not technically Buddhism if you're not adopting certain beliefs about the afterlife and so on. But in my case, I'm not necessarily practicing these Buddhist practices to be a good Buddhist. I'm doing it to improve my psychology, and I find that it works. So to me, following Buddhism the right way, or however you want to phrase it, is not necessarily what I consider most important. I consider what's most important to be, how does it influence my psychological well-being? So that's a little about what I think about, the ways in which we can improve psychological well-being. Now, after I went through this process, it led me to another question. Okay, well, I've got a pretty good strategy for improving my psychological well-being. I don't need tons of money. I don't need tons of friends. I don't need, fancy car, fancy house. I don't even need productive work, or I don't even need anything really. All I need is just to meditate and to follow these Buddhist practices to feel really, really good. So after I'd kind of solved that problem, then my next question was, all right, so this is great. I'm feeling good, but there's a problem, which is that I'm going to die. And when I had COVID-19, which was the catalyst for some of these thoughts, because I never really considered my own mortality, as most young people probably, unless they've had the death of a loved one or a close friend, they may not have really considered what it means for their consciousness, the same consciousness that is listening to these words right now, for that consciousness to be permanently erased. And for that experience, which is, we can assume, similar to that of a general anesthetic, to remain indefinitely. It's kind of horrifying. And when I kind of had COVID, and because obviously I'm young, and tying back to what we talked about before with immunosenescence and having a robust immune system as a young person, I didn't expect to die, but let's just say death was on my mind, just because, when you have this sort of thing, and it ties back to the biopsychosocial model, that it describes the interaction between what you see in the social environment and, in this case, the media frenzy of people dying, and how that affects you psychologically and biologically. I was thinking somewhat about death, and when I started thinking about death, it made me think about my mother, who died of cancer at the age of 55 in 2016, and that was an experience that I never really understood. I didn't understand, like, why did she die? Why did she die at this age? And another event that kind of catalyzed my interest in this aging field was my grandfather, who I mentioned, he turns 100 this year. He was born in 1921. The reason why a lot of these realizations came from thinking about my grandfather was because he's like my best friend. And he and I, even though we are, decades and decades apart in terms of when we were born, we're very similar. And when I talk to him, it's like talking to myself in the future. We're that similar. He was a scientist as well. He's got a very curious mind, and we make jokes. And it's like talking to your best friend growing up, except that he was born in the 1920s, right? Which is quite a long time ago, and he's turning 100. And so when I talk to him, it's so inspiring, yet also so tragic that this friend of mine is in a body that is decaying, right? Like, my best friend is in this body that has early signs of cancer, has early signs of neurodegeneration, has early signs of cardiovascular disease and some heart problems, and there's nothing I can do about it. And this is like my best friend. So this person who I talk to, who I see so much of myself in, who's just like, not only family, but like one of my best friends, especially since my mum passed away. This person is dying before my eyes. He can barely walk, and he's slowly losing his memory, and that's healthy aging and a good life. And here's the crucial point: is that, number one, there's nothing that the doctors can do for him. He's turning 100 years old. What can they do for him? And it's remarkable because he actually smoked for 75 years of his life. And we can talk about certain factors involved in healthy longevity, but just very briefly to touch on this point, and I know I'm kind of dipping in and out, but some of the longest lived people, like there was a Japanese woman who recently turned 118 just a couple of weeks ago. I think she's only the third person to reach that age, and she drinks Coke. There's a photo of her on the internet drinking Coke. So there is a genetic component to aging as well, and especially in supercentenarians. In the general public, a lot of the longevity that people have and their life expectancy is based on their lifestyle factors. It's about 80-20, 20% genetics, 80% lifestyle. But in the case of these super centenarians, there can be a strong genetic component, and there's also quite a strong, social component and quite a strong interaction of like their community and their family. And that's why we see there's certain families in certain regions of the world called blue zones where people live much longer, and they have higher numbers of centenarians. And actually last year in 2020, I actually visited two of the blue zones, which are Sardinia, so this island in Italy, where they have these small mountainous villages where they have the highest recorded number of or the highest density, I suppose, of centenarians in the world, and Icaria in Greece. So during the pandemic, I wanted to kind of escape the mayhem in the UK, so I hopped over to these islands in Europe where they have these long-lived populations, and that's a whole nother story that we could go into about what did I learn talking to these 100-year-olds. There's actually a documentary on, I think, Amazon Prime or Netflix with Zac Efron, and he actually talks to the same people that I talked to in this village called Ciolo, which is in Sardinia in Italy, and it's very fascinating to talk to these centenarians because this village, which only has a population of about 2,000 people, has something like 20 people in the last decade who lived over 100. So they have remarkable longevity, which is 10 or hundreds of times higher than the typical rate of centenarians. And we can go into that as well as another angle, or maybe another time, about what are the longevity strategies of these people in these blue zones who live remarkably long. But ultimately, I'm not as interested in the blue zone kind of stuff, simply because I think whatever they have done with famines that kind of resemble intermittent fasting and with strong social ties, all of that will be superseded by technology anyway when we get better anti-aging drugs. So I'm less interested in that. Anyway, to go back to my grandfather. So my grandfather, number one, is that medicine can't do much for him because he's old. And that really saddened me. I want my grandfather to keep living because he's my best friend. He doesn't necessarily want to die. And I think, and number two is that having a long, happy life doesn't mean you want to die. If anything, it would mean you would want to keep living. So if you look at my grandfather, he's got children. He's got 5 children. He's got many grandchildren, and he's got great-grandchildren. He has lived with his wife, my grandmother, who passed away a few years ago, for 75 years. They were married, 75 years. And he owned his own house. He lived the first 40 years of his life in India before moving to Australia, where he lived the next, 60 years as of this year. And, he had a good job that he enjoyed as a scientist, as a chemist. And, if you look at his life, it's the quintessential long, happy life. He also smoked for 70 years, a pack of cigarettes a day, and he drank port, this fortified wine. So he lived the long, happy life, but that doesn't change the fact that right now he is a conscious entity, like me, like you, like everyone listening, who is trapped within a body that is decaying. That is the horror of aging. It doesn't matter if you've lived literally 100 years of a happy life. You're going to be trapped in a body that is decaying from the inside out, and that's going to kill you unless we solve aging. And like these sort of realizations, what really prompted me to realize, okay, I might feel good with my meditation and these Buddhist practices and so on, but I'm also aging, and that doesn't seem good. So now that I've kind of sorted out the psychological well-being side, let's take a look at aging, and let's take a look at keeping the psychology, the psychological well-being. Let's take a look at how we can keep that going for as long as possible. So this is quite a brief description, but this kind of introduces how I got involved in the field and the initial kind of thoughts that I had that led me to think that aging was a big problem. Now, when I actually woke up from the pro-aging trance, it was very horrifying, because after I had these sort of realizations that I just described, I was very shocked. I was like, oh my God, I'm actually dying right now. Like in the sense that my disease risk and the changes in my body that are occurring right now are actually going to kill me. And this was also compounded by the fact that during my neuroscience master's degree, I learned about how the onset of Alzheimer's disease or any neurodegenerative disease is preceded by, say, 10, 20, 30 years of kind of changes, right? So Alzheimer's doesn't come out of nowhere, right? There's a long, protracted period of subclinical progression whereby your brain is actually deteriorating, but it hasn't deteriorated to a sufficient amount where you can actually notice the memory problems, right? So, these psychiatric conditions are diagnosed primarily by symptomatology, but that doesn't necessarily reflect the underlying biology, in the sense that you could have a very long period where it goes undiagnosed, which is normally the case for 10, 20 years before someone gets Alzheimer's disease, where you're actually accumulating more and more damage in your brain. We don't really have the technology today to measure that, although that's kind of getting better with imaging and neuroimaging and so on. But you're actually getting closer to Alzheimer's for a long time before you get Alzheimer's. And when I learned about these sort of facts, that made me really think that, oh my God, even though I'm quite young now, I'm actually dying. Like, that was such a paradigm shift for me. And I talked to a philosopher here at Oxford who told me I should write a book called When Living Became Dying, because that kind of summarizes this paradigmatic shift I had in my psychology, when it was like, oh shit, I thought I was healthy. And even though I am young and healthy, I'm also dying every second, because every single second I'm accumulating more and more damage in my body that's eventually going to kill me. And unless I can repair that damage, I'm screwed, as is everyone I love, as is everyone in the entire world. So then that actually was quite horrifying, and temporarily took me out of my meditative state of well-being, ironically enough. And so I started looking at, okay, how can we solve aging? So I did a lot of Googling. I basically spent 3 months on my computer watching talks by David Sinclair, Aubrey de Grey, reading their books, reading 1,000 or so scientific papers about the hallmarks of aging, about different therapeutic approaches, research from here at Oxford with Lynn Cox's lab, David Sinclair at Harvard, Professor Joao Pedro at University of Liverpool, Eric Verdin at the Buck Institute, and Judith Campisi at the Buck Institute, people like Brian Kennedy from NUS. And I started watching all these talks and, going to some of the conferences, like the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories Mechanisms of Aging Conference, the ARDD conference and so on that Alex Zarenkov hosts. And I started really learning and immersing myself amongst all these aging researchers, because basically I was pretty deeply concerned about the fact that I was dying every second. And I wanted to know, okay, is there a way that I can slow this process? Is it even possible? And what I learned through going to these conferences and talking to these people is that, yeah, it's actually very feasible that we can slow the aging process. And we have a lot of evidence to suggest that health span and lifespan are malleable. And as soon as I kind of appraised the field of geroscience and the anti-aging and longevity biotech well enough to kind of reach this conclusion, suddenly that became my life focus. Because if you don't have life, you don't have anything else. And right now, the two biggest threats to our life are aging and probably, AI, if we're being honest. So AI, I don't feel particularly qualified to kind of help with that problem with AI safety. So I'll leave that to the experts. But with aging, I think that, there's such an opportunity for any young biologists or people in the medical space involved in, medicine as doctors, or even people in biotech, even the general public, to really take an interest in their own aging and their own anti-aging. And the way they can do this is by learning about the field, by reading David Sinclair, Aubrey de Grey, by maybe attending some of these talks or conferences, and just trying to become educated. Because what really astounded me as well, and this is also ties into why I was invited to give a lecture at Oxford University and Monash University in Australia on this topic of aging and neurodegeneration, was that we go through entire medical courses without learning about aging. Now, I didn't study medicine. I studied preclinical medicine, which is called biomedical science in Australia. But I went through 4 years of biomedical science without a single lecture explaining what are the hallmarks of aging. Now, think about how absurd that is. You've got a 4-year course with hundreds of hours of content from some of the best lecturers, and you're not teaching people about the thing that kills 90% of people in Australia. Like, that seems pretty absurd when you think about it. So what I did was I created a lecture and I pitched it to my unit coordinators when I was studying, and they said, yeah, this is actually a pretty important topic. Why don't you go ahead and give some lectures? But the thing is, I'm not the most qualified person to do this, but I think that someone needs to do it. And I think that, if there are people within the field, or even doctors who are interested in this field, you guys can start learning about this field, can start reading up on this field, can start attending these conferences and educating others. I'm just a humble scientist, but I'm by no means an expert in this field. But I just think it's genuinely important. And I think that the more people who can start looking at the science, start understanding what aging is and why it's such a big problem in public health, and the different ways that we can start intervening, the better. Because at the end of the day, all of us, if we don't die of something else, all of us are going to die of aging. That's a fact under the status quo. And that is something that, although a lot of people don't realize it, it is something that can be changed. And I think that there's a very strong rationale, both from a personal perspective and from an altruistic perspective, to want to contribute to this fight against aging.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap things up. I know this is actually going to be the longest podcast that I've done to date, but I think it's appropriate because we're talking about what it sounds like we both somewhat agree on is, probably the biggest problem that we have to solve as humanity, which is aging, so we can all live longer, healthier lives. And then, to your point, we can worry about the happiness in parallel. But being healthy and living a long time sounds great to me. And despite some of the protests of overpopulation or death gives meaning to life, I'll take my chances with feeling like I'm 20 or 30 when I'm 150 years old or something like that. And I think that also, you mentioned how you've only somewhat recently become interested in the space, and a lot of doctors and scientists and young individuals can kind of do the same. But I think very quickly you've kind of developed yourself into one of, if not the best communicator in the world of this science and of this progress. And, I love listening to people like Aubrey de Grey and David Sinclair as well. But as someone who just kind of picked up the science and started, dove into a number of books and 1,000, you know, scientific papers and kind of familiarize yourself with science and the background and science communication, I think hopefully this conversation has served as an excellent introduction for a lot of people. And that's really all you need to kind of open your eyes to the possibilities of some of this. And I think it's a very hopeful and optimistic and feasible future that we've been talking about. So I want to thank you, Jack, for coming on and spending the time today. Lastly, where can people go to follow some of what you're doing and some of this work, or maybe find places to learn and contribute in whatever ways they can?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks a lot, Jake. I really appreciate this opportunity, because I think if I can convince one person to become interested in this field, then I think it will be an absolute success. And so, I think doing this podcast and inspiring others is the way that we can get more people interested, more people excited. So if people are interested in this topic, have a read of my post on the website lesswrong.com, LESS wrong.com. Just type in anti-aging and it should come up. And just keep posted on Less Wrong, because I plan to write some other articles covering some of the topics that I touched on today very shortly.